I'm Lee Milan. In this video, we're going to look at track routing and monitoring within Ableton Live. Track routing is when we can choose the source or the destination of an audio or MIDI track within Ableton Live. And monitoring is the behavior of how input sounds may or may not pass through to the outputs of those tracks as well. So to get started, we need to reveal the input and output section to do our track routing. So there's a little I/O hide box here, which you can bring up. If you find that your screen display doesn't pop any display up with this, your resolution is quite small and you just need to hide things like the sends and returns or even the mixer part just to make sure there's space for the input and output section to show. So in terms of how our chooser menus work is if it's a MIDI track, you can choose where it will receive MIDI from. And then if there's an instrument on that track, the instrument actually outputs audio. So the output section of that track will be an audio routing option. If it's an audio track, we can choose an audio input and then we can choose an audio output too. And you notice that these ones are in their default state, which means that this bass instrument here is going to the master track, so to our mix, and then this reference track is going to our mix as well. So let's have a look at a few contexts of how we want to set up our routing and then how the monitoring section might influence how the behavior works and what works best in each situation. So one context that we might want to use a separate output choice for a track is that it's a reference track. So it's a track that's a commercial release that we use as our holy grail of production ability. And we want it in our project so we can refer to it every now and then when we're working on our own stuff and hear ours versus there. Now, we can mute a reference track, and whenever we're ready to listen to it, we can hit solo, and then the rest of our project gets muted and we hear the reference track. But the problem is the reference track runs through the master track. Now, if that's happening and on your master track, you have some different processing on there. I have a compressor and then I have a utility device. Those are two processors that are changing the sound of my mix. The reference track also goes through theirs, and you'll be chasing your tail because the reference track will be running through additional processing beyond how that track was released to be ready to be heard by the public. So what we can do is use the audio 2 in the reference track section and route that to external out, and that can run directly to an available output on our audio interface. So 1 and 2 will be the most likely one you want to go for because that's the one your speakers will most likely be connected to. Or if you have, let's say, an external mixing console and you have multiple outs running to that external hardware mixer, you can go to the output configuration and enable additional outputs on the interface and route, in this case, the reference track to those two. And in that case, you could have your main mix running through 1 and 2 of the audio interface to your mixing console, and then on another channel you can have your reference track running to there as well. So external and then 3 and 4. So that's one use of using these different destinations for audio output routing. Now I have a bass track here which is a MIDI track, so MIDI data notes go into it and then the instrument turns it into audio, which I've mentioned already. Another reason why we might want to do some routing with our MIDI is that we have a sound and we want to experiment with other layers that can go with that sound. And there's a few different ways we can do this, but a very quick and easy way to experiment with this is to basically have a few MIDI tracks containing the additional sounds you want to experiment with, but having one of those tracks be the actual control track, so the one that receives the MIDI data and then sends the data that's duplicated to the other tracks. So they play in unison when you hold the key. The other 2 or however many tracks you want to layer with this, they all play the same note that you're playing on the clip or on a MIDI controller. So what I'm going to do is I have a bass idea here. Okay, so that's quite muted in terms of it being very low frequency orientated with only a tiny bit of higher frequencies for the actual timbre of the sound. So I want to experiment with a layer that's going to add a lot more into the mid and upper frequencies. So I'm going to create a new MIDI track, so Command, Shift and T. I'm going to call this bass upper because I already have an idea of what its function is with what I'm going for. So without doing the routing, the way we could try and quickly do this would be to hold Alt and drag the MIDI clip across to there and then play a duplicate of the MIDI data on a new track. But the problem is, as you're experimenting with the layers, if you change your mind about the notes, you're going to have to change one and then change the next copy of that again. So let's delete that clip and let's tell this bass upper track to listen to the other bass's MIDI. So I'm going to go to MIDI from this time and select past all the input options of MIDI controllers, which is the first thing on the chooser menu. And I'm going to go to the next part of the menu, which shows us tracks that are already existing within our Ableton Live set. So there's the drum track there, which I don't want to use right now, but there is that bass track. So if I choose that bass track now, when I press play, you can see there's MIDI activity now appearing on that new track that's echoing the activity of the other track too. This isn't sound, this is going to the track before it goes to the instrument and just taking a copy of that MIDI data and passing it to this next track. Now at the moment, if I drag, let's say just an analog instrument to there, the MIDI data is arriving there, but it's not passing through the track. Now if we wanted to play that track, we just record arm it, and then I can use my keyboard and play that. Oh, sorry, I've done the routing for the input. So I've disassociated the input for the MIDI controllers. But if I wanted to play it, I could just have it in record arm mode and it would work. But what I want it to do is pass the input of the data through to the instrument. So what I need to do is instead set the monitor to in, so it's listening to that MIDI data coming in from the other track. And then I can record arm that first track and then play from there. So from a compositional point of view with a controller, that's easy now. I can just play one controller and have one extra layer in this case, or I could create a new MIDI track and also tell that one to listen to that initial MIDI track, the bass track, and have that happen. Now, what we call these options on the chooser menu is where we're going to tap in from. So basically where we're going to take a feed from. The first menu is choosing the track itself. The second menu is choosing where in the sequence of MIDI data we want to take that. So for instance, if I had on my bass track, if I had a MIDI effect on there, so let's just go for note length. And I'll make the actual length of the notes really short for that bass. I'll just mute that second layer for a minute. Okay, we just made those notes a little bit longer. So for the bass, the initial bass layer, the processor, the MIDI processor, is currently making those notes really short. Even though they're longer on the actual clip, it's processing those MIDI notes and then that's feeding to my initial bass instrument, which makes that first sound. Now, when I'm taking a copy of that MIDI data, I can choose whether I take it pre that MIDI note length device that I just added or after it. Do I want it to take the MIDI once it's been modified by the MIDI effects, or do I want just the raw MIDI that's in the MIDI clip and then copy that to the new layer too? So we should hear a difference. If we go pre-effects, so pre-effects, we're hearing the notes as they are in the actual MIDI clip, and then post-effects, we're hearing them once they've been modified by the MIDI device that's on this track here too. So that's a quick and easy way of creating a single control MIDI track where we can input a MIDI clip, one MIDI clip, or use MIDI controllers to control multiple layers. Another thing we can do is basically choose unique MIDI controllers to control one track over another. This is really good for collaborative stuff, or even if you fancy yourself as an 80s synth god and you want to have one keyboard playing one sound here and another hand playing another sound here too. So it's quite fun. It's a good way to get interacting with the different sounds you might have in your project. So in order to do this, we're going to use the input part of the MIDI tracks to choose an actual controller this time, rather than another track. And we're going to tell one of them to listen to this key step and one of them to listen to the push unit. So by default, tracks will say all ins. So all MIDI controllers that are currently plugged into Ableton Live, as long as in preferences, so let's just go there quickly. As long as in MIDI preferences, the input for those controllers is set to track, then you can tell those different devices to control different tracks. So I'm going to tell the bass to come from the key step, So I'll choose the key step here. And I'm going to disconnect that association of the upper bass, copying the MIDI from the original bass now, and I'm going to choose the push input too. So as long as I have these record armed, and I'll set monitor to auto now, I can control one sound from push, the other from the other controller too. So again, I said it's very good for collaborative work. Few of you in the room maybe want to start an idea without getting sort of immediately caught in the graphical aspect of making music on a piece of software. You instead want to just get the right sounds together in the project first and then give everyone the control over what those instruments will play. So one could even be a drum pad and someone could be playing drums as you jam, someone could be playing bass, someone can play some pads and so on as well. So you noticed I changed the monitor behavior when I had to get that track to respond to its input. So let's just explain the monitor situation. So I've already said that monitor in means that the input passes through to the output. Now, if we set it to monitor auto, what it means is the sound will pass through the track as long as it's record armed. But if there's a clip playing, that will override. And that's especially useful in terms of when we're dealing with audio clips. Do we want to hear what's coming in on that audio track? Once we've recorded it, do we want to still hear the input or do we now want to hear the recorded clip? So setting it to auto means that you'll hear the input live as it runs through Ableton's mixer. And as soon as you recorded a clip and it plays back, it will override the input, that will be muted, and we hear the audio clip that's been recorded. So we've got separate inputs for MIDI tracks. We've done using one MIDI track to be able to feed other MIDI tracks as well. Let's have a look at a different way of doing routing. And we've looked at the reference tracks and sending that to a separate output too. Let's bring in an audio track this time. And I'm going to call this, I'll call this my snare. So I'm just going to load in a really simple drum sound for this beat. And let's just play that. So I'll rename that. It's not actually a snare, it's a side stick. I'm actually pressing Command and R when I click the title to quickly rename. I can do Control and click to get it from the context menu that pops up there as well. So at the moment, inside the drum rack, we have all the different sounds, and I'm just going to identify where that side stick sound's coming from. So it's this 909 rim, which is there. So what we can do here with this audio track, inputs, we can choose external. That's the kind of the thing it assumes you first want to do with an audio track. Do you want to take something from the outside world through your audio interface and record it into Ableton Live? But if we go further down, we can find more of these tracks within our Ableton Live set. So I want to listen to my drums track, and I want to grab that side stick and route it separately outside of the drum rack. So the next chooser menu, and as I mentioned the word taps before, which is tapping from one place to bring to another. We have the whole drum kit as a whole we can take and feed through this additional mixer. And then we have the individual sounds, and similar to what we did with the MIDI routing, we have a pre-effects tap point, post-effects tap point. Both of those are not affected by the volume of the mixer within Ableton Live, but then we have post-mixer as a tap point, which is affected by that volume control as well. So I want to have, let's have a quick look at that side stick. So it's just a sample, it has no additional processing. So I don't necessarily need to say I want to take that audio after the processing's happened to it, because there is none there. So I can choose to take it pre-effects, which means it takes it directly from the output of that sampler playing that rim sample. So I go to side stick, go to my chooser menu to take this tap from that source to this destination. And let's go to rim and then pre-effects. So if I press play now, okay, so we can still hear the rim playing through, so I'm just going to mute that there. But if you look at the input for the new audio track that we're going to extract this rim sound and have it separate in our mixing environment, it's still showing up as an input for the audio track. So based on what we've talked about, If we wanted to record the sound of the rim playing, we could set it to auto, record enable it, which would let us hear the rim as it plays, but as soon as we record it and that recording's done, we'll then hear the recording of the rim sound. Instead, I just want it to pass through at all times. I'm not going to record this, I just want to treat it in a different way from the rest of the drum rack. So I'm going to set it to monitor in, and then now, my side stick's now rerouted to a different destination, or should I say there's a copy of it running to this track. I've muted it from the mixer in the drum rack, and now I have it on a separate track here as well. So I can treat this differently in terms of having very separate processing. Automation can be very separate from the drum rack environment. We can do processing and automation in a drum rack, but it's 16 pads in this one, all in one environment. So having this separate can make it a bit easier to kind of associate what belongs where in terms of your audio routing versus all the possibilities of how we can route drum racks, but basically having it all clustered and a bit confusing to work with. So my drum rack rim sample is now running separately to a different track within Ableton Live, and it's set to monitor in, so it's constantly letting that input run to that output no matter what I do. So that's set up the way I want it to be. When we're dealing with this routing options, there's a few ways that we can choose to do it which give us another way of doing a task that's already possible. So let me give you context for that. If I put these two tracks here and I choose group, we can group those tracks. Visually, they're grouped. They're in a folder system now together. And then sonically, they're grouped too. So both those tracks now run through. I'm just going to have to mute that crash symbol, I think, that's running through there. That's a bit overpowering. But the sounds are now grouped and running through that particular group that's running here, and that could be our drums and bass group. But when we get quite complex musical information going, lots of instrumentation, lots of things happening, sometimes you might want one sound to be mixed separately from everything else. So there's a name that's commonly used for it. It's like an all but group. So you might want to choose to have a group that has everything but one key sound in your mix that you want to make sure is right at the foreground of your mix, and then everything else can run through this sub-mix, and you can control it, maybe side chain, compress it, so it ducks out the way of this foreground sound. Now, in terms of doing that in a larger mixing environment, it's a bit trickier to do it with groups and keep things separate. So what we can do instead, let's just ungroup that for a minute. So what we can do is we can change this side stick to be the kick. That's the first thing to do. So the kick 909, I think, is the one we want. And we'll change that little chooser menu to tap from the kick. And let's just mute that. So the rim's still running through the drum right now. Okay, so that's my kick now running through there. So I'm going to, I could group using this group function here, but if I want to visually keep things as they are, but route the audio itself, I'm going to create a group track. Now, if anyone's familiar with the older version of Ableton Live, before grouping as a function came in, this is how we used to have to do it. And a lot of people don't use it anymore, but it's still a really easy way of keeping things visually clear so you know where things are routed. So I'm going to call this all but kick. And then all I need to do is go to all the tracks in my project. Now I've only got 2 that are actually being used right now, but it could be 10, 20 tracks depending on how dense your instrumentation is. And then we go to that audio 2 routing, which is currently running to the master, so the mix bus, and we choose audio 2 for one of these 2 highlighted tracks, and we send it to all but kick. Now, because I highlighted those both first using Shift, changing one of them changed all the highlighted ones too. So you don't have to go and click every single one and send it to this all but group. So hopefully you know what monitor I'm going to set to now, because I want all those sounds to run through this new track as a sub mix. I want them to be put together, but I want that kick to still remain in the Ableton Live mix environment separately to everything else. So I need to set it to monitor in to allow the sound to pass through. Now, if you're on a laptop where you've got a built-in microphone, it's important to think about what else might be running into this track. Now, right now it says audio from on the track, and it says input 1 from external in, which is actually my onboard microphone. So if I set it to no input, I still have the output of these tracks routing to that all but kick group, but I've chosen to not independently also tell that track to listen to an external source, because you'll get feedback quite quickly if you do that. So I'm going to set that to monitor in. So this will be everything but the kick. And that's my kick. So at this point, I could then go and add some treatment to this. So it could be a compressor there. And I tell that compressor to duck when that kick track plays. We just, for easy demonstration purposes, set it to a very broad setting, so it's very easy to hear. But now, everything in my mix but the kick will duck down when the kick plays, which gives me a chance to get a bit more power out of that foreground sound and put everything else as secondary in terms of its presence in the mix. So you can hear that kick's making everything else in our mix duck down at this point. So we've looked at quite a few different options in terms of MIDI and audio track routing based on the context of what we want to do at any time in our sort of creative work that we do within Ableton Live. One final thing that you might want to do is just quickly reimagine the ideas of what you've got going. So trying to have a sort of a sampling, reworking kind of mentality. A track can be set to an input of resampling, which basically routes the output of the master track back into the mix environment. However, it will not let you hear the actual track that's taken that feed or that tap from the master track that's coming back into the mix environment. If you did that, you'd create a feedback loop and you'd get a very loud sound very quickly. So resampling is a very good way of very quickly re-recording whatever's going on in your project. So if it's stuff soloed, you'll record the soloed stuff because that's what you're hearing through the master track. Or it could be the entire song, and maybe you like the sounds, you like kind of the general idea of what's going, but you just know it's not really that much of a catchy idea. What you can do is set this to resample, record arm it, and hit record, and just record for however long the output of what you have going, and then feed that into a sampler or a simpler device and rework it, or put it as audio on the track and then chop it up and rework it too. So I'll just quickly show that before we finish. So I'm going to hit record. Okay, so now you notice we didn't hear that recording until it was recorded, and then it plays back because it's no longer going to create a feedback loop because it's a recorded version of our master track. So now that can be easily dropped into arrangement view. We can turn back to arrangement on for that track. We can click and press Command and E and rework it that way. Or alternatively, we could go to something like a simpler device, just drag that down there. And if I just drag that audio to a simpler and then put it into slice mode, all of a sudden, if we just make sure that's armed, be able to completely rework my idea as if it's a sample from elsewhere and have a new creative strategy on it. So we've been looking at track routing and monitoring in Ableton Live, and there's a lot of well, pardon the pun, lots of ins and outs to this. But the key thing is, based on different situations that you want to go for, you just may want to route things a certain way to make it work best for that environment. And the in and out section is the best thing for that. And then the behavior between inputs running to outputs or clips being played when they're available and being played is what the monitoring section is all about.